Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, August 11th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about Latino voters in the United States of America in the 2026 midterm elections. A lot of new data points coming from across the country have shown that Donald Trump's approval rating in specific amongst Latino voters is dropping across the country and in a number of battleground states. Now, this MSNBC opinion piece pretty much summarizes, I think, a lot of what Democrats are looking to as this opportunity is potentially something that might be missed by Democrats going into the midterm elections, but a wide open opportunity over the next year and a half should they decide to tap into it. Because for the first time in a long time, Donald Trump's approval rating is in a complete and total free fall, and especially amongst Latino voters that were crucial in his election victory in the 2024 presidential election, are starting to sour on him across the country. In the last presidential election, if you remember, not this one, but 2024, we saw that generally speaking, there were minor improvements for Donald Trump amongst key demographic groups, but a very major improvement on the 2024 data points that we saw in that election cycle. The exit polling data between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump amongst Latino voters was 51% for Kamala Harris to 46% for Donald Trump, the narrowest we've seen the Latino vote across this country in the 21st century as a voting group. While not a monolith, broken down by demographic, has overwhelmingly supported the Democratic Party time and time again in a multitude of different elections. And that brings us to the 2024 presidential election, when we saw that Donald Trump winning in a number of these states, again, was largely reliant on Donald Trump doing better amongst key constituencies. When you look at places like Arizona and Nevada and Texas and New Mexico, all states that saw massive shifts from the last cycle. We can actually look at a shift map here to better show an example of it. But when you take a look at election versus election, Texas shifted by 8 points to the right. New Mexico, 5 points to the right. Arizona, 6 points to the right. Nevada, 6 points to the right. California, 9 points to the right. And I'm not going to chalk it all up to being a shift in Latino voters, but it absolutely is, without a doubt, a huge part of this shift. When voters in Texas, for instance, take a look at how they voted in 2024 versus 2020, it is predominantly Hispanic regions that you'll find that voters across the southern border, where there's a much higher concentration of Hispanic voters in these states than in other parts of the state. For instance, again, look across the southern border compared to areas around, major cities in Texas, where you'll see that the red shift is a little bit more, a little bit less, versus massive shifts across the southern border. You look all the way down where Brownsville is, you're at a 19-point shift. Go all the way out to El Paso, a 20-point shift. I mean, you are talking about monumental shifts, and a big reason for that was the narrowing of the Hispanic vote in a way that had not been seen before. Looking at elections like 2020, Joe Biden won that presidential election. And to no one's surprise, based on the data that we saw, his victory amongst key demographics were improved upon Kamala Harris. But looking at that white demographic breakdown, Donald Trump got about 57% of the white vote. Kamala Harris got about 42%. Kamala Harris actually in the exit polls outpaced Biden amongst white voters, being the only demographic group that she did so. But it wasn't enough to counteract the massive losses that Democrats saw amongst Latino voters and to a smaller degree, Asian voters. But looking at that point, 2020's election exit polling data, Kamala Harris, again, based on CNN's data points, won Hispanic voters, Latino voters by 5 points. In 2020, Biden won them by over 30 points. He won them by 33%. Same percentage of the electorate, white voters went up in this cycle, but Latino voters made up roughly the exact same 13 to 11%, a slight decrease. But either way, it's a demographic the Democrats were relying on and relied on for victory in 2020. And what it did for them in 2020 was ushered in victories across a number of states. You saw it in states like Colorado that went from being Clinton plus 4.9, huge Hispanic population in the state, Biden wins the state by 14. Arizona flipping for the first time since Bill Clinton won it in 1996. These things don't come easily, and they come with a very broad and wide coalition where Democrats can, in fact, rely on minority voting areas that, have predominantly and historically voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. In 2018, and I promise we'll get to the actual points here about Donald Trump dropping in approval, but I have to make the electoral point. That's the whole point of why we talk about these things. When you take a look at the 2018 exit polls based on 2016, Democrats actually made minor improvements amongst Hispanic voters in 2018 based off 2016, when they lost the election. And what did that usher in? Democrats winning in states like Arizona, flipping a Senate race there, flipping a Senate race in Nevada. And I'm not just going to argue that Hispanic voters are contained to states across, the Sun Belt. They are all across the country and are, again, a demographic group that Democrats have historically relied on, historically needed for victory. And in 2024, that collapsed. And as a result, Democrats did too. Looking at the 2016 exit polls, the last one we'll look at here is where you can really see this drop off. Even Hillary Clinton, who lost the election to Donald Trump by less of a margin than Kamala Harris, but lost the election to Donald Trump, won Hispanic and Latino voters by more than Biden. She won them by 36 percentage points. This was the result that gave Hillary Clinton, if you look at some of these states and the elections, a 1-point loss in Florida, in contrast with Harris's 13-point loss in Florida, a 3.5% loss in Arizona, in contrast with a 5.5% loss in Arizona, a 9-point loss in Texas, in contrast with a 14-point loss in Texas. These things you can start to see in terms of its direct electoral repercussions, and the exit polling data only continues to add up. Now, let's talk about Trump's approval rating today. What we know on the broad strokes is that Donald Trump is unpopular across this country. Voters are not thrilled with everything that is coming out of this second Trump administration. And arguably, it's a lot like the first one. Voters gave Trump a chance in the election. He sold and promised them everything. And now voters are upset with the way that things are going. And whether you agree or disagree, to the point that Trump is doing what he said he would do, that's a different point than how Americans view it. Because while the majority of the nation is saying Donald Trump is following through on his promises, I promise you the majority of the nation no longer supports tariffs like they did in the 24 election. The majority of the nation, this is proven, no longer supports mass deportations. And even then, I wouldn't even have argued that they overwhelmingly supported it in 24, but they preferred it to Vice President Harris, at least based on how they were voting and the calculus there. And thinking about what has been happening, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy, Donald Trump is losing a lot of voters, and especially a very key constituency that if Republicans want any hope of winning in 26 or any hope of winning in 28, they need to stop the bleeding. Because what this data is now telling us is that Donald Trump is really angering a huge portion of Latino voters that backed him in the last election. Donald Trump's approval rating is down from where it was 3 months ago, way down from where it was 6 months ago. And again, that's no real surprise. The big problem for Donald Trump is that Latino Trump voters are not as set on voting for Republicans in 2026 as Latino Kamala Harris voters are on supporting Democrats in 2026. They asked this question: if you voted for Donald Trump, who are you voting for in the generic ballot? Just 67% of Trump voters that are Latino say they will back the Republican nominee for whatever race they're voting in 2026. In direct contrast with a whopping 86% of Latino Kamala Harris voters that say that they will vote for the Democrat in the midterm election. 8% of those Trump voters say outright they'll vote for a Democrat, and 20% of that voting base is undecided as it stands right now. 20% are undecided. And so when you think about this too, amongst Latinos who supported Biden in 2020 and then Trump in 2024, there's a lot of voters across the country, not just Latino voters who did that, but a lot who disapprove of the job that Donald Trump is doing. His approval rating is equal. This is a 100%, voting bloc that voted for him in 2024, and only half of them approve of him in this election. And that's huge. I mean, that is certainly the story that needs to be told. And it shows again, yes, right now, if Democrats do not tap into this, will undoubtedly be what we call a missed opportunity in electoral politics. And when you actually break it down as to why Latino voters are souring on Trump, I think that the standard political calculus has been that we are finding that with an administration that is disproportionately going after and seeking mass deportation specifically in Latino communities, that is an aspect of disapproval on the broad end. But also, and most importantly, what this survey tells us is that it isn't the mass deportations and the messaging around it that is hammering in Trump the most. It is quite frankly and quite simply the United States economy. 64% of Latino voters rank the U.S. economy as somewhat or very poor. Just about a third can say that it's somewhat or very good. The overwhelming majority say we don't like the way the economy is going. The same as the American public. But his approval on the economy is significantly worse than it is amongst the regular American public. It is, after all, white voters that keep Donald Trump's numbers higher than what every other demographic group would tell us. But looking at the last election, Republicans were hoping that they were building out a coalition that not just was reliant on white voters for victory, as Republicans have historically, but minority voters too, and specifically Latino voters in these elections. But they're not seeing it. And looking at the economy being an eroded weakness, this is something that Democrats are now finding that amongst Latino voters, they are more trusted on the cost of living than Republicans, plus 19. In 2024, that was in the negative. This is a massive, massive difference. And in these battleground states, it's a 5-point margin. By the time you reach the election, this will be even more because it's only moving and trending in a direction that Democrats are improving upon, and Republicans just simply are not. And what you're finding is that, yes, this approval and disapproval for Trump hasn't directly translated to Democratic support, and this is where the electoral opportunity comes in from the nation's second most powerful political party. And that is where you could find it happening. Because the 2018 results really spoke for itself when you saw states like Texas, that you did see a massive reversion away from Donald Trump and enthusiasm against him. And for Democrats, yes, amongst white voters and Asian voters and black voters, but specifically Latino voters in this state came out in record numbers and got Beto O'Rourke within 3 points of the Texas Senate race. That is the way that Democrats can move forward, because here's the thing. Looking at these 2018 numbers and looking at these 2020 numbers, if Democrats can return to the day and age where they're winning back, I mean, look at the numbers here. Black voters really didn't shift. Maybe a point in a different direction, but Latino voters and Asian voters, tremendously, Latino voters made up a higher portion, nearly 3 times or over 3 times the, amount of Asian voters across the country by broken down percentage of the demographic. But the point is, what I'm trying to get at is that if the numbers do return to the 2020 results, where Latino voters are backing Trump, this would have been a 2-year reversion of Donald Trump's 12-year-long, or 10-year-long, decade-long effort at moving over Latino voters to the Republican Party. Because this has been the end game for the Republican Party, that they were going to see these years of investment and time and energy put into minority communities across the country, and arguably, in many cases, catching the Democratic Party sleeping at the wheel, where they became so reliant, they took minority voters for granted to some degree. I don't think any Democrat can really contest that, and especially a lot of the states where maybe if you don't contest it, the voters believe it and feel it from the National Party, or at least did. And now they're feeling it from Donald Trump. Because it is never a good place to be that just 2/3 of the voters that voted for you in the last cycle are now saying they're voting for Republicans, and 1/3 say, I'm voting for somebody else, or I haven't made my decision. Or that the approval rating of voters that were conveyed and switched from Biden plus 20 in 2020 to Trump in 2024, that Democrats are now at a point where 50% of them are aligned with being in disapproval of Donald Trump's second administration. And whether it's the economy, whether it's cuts to Medicaid, whether it's mass deportations, whether it's all these different issues. Like the video I made yesterday talking about how voters are just upset with Donald Trump's administration on every issue point. Again, foreign or domestic policy, it's all underwater. It is now translating to changes in the way key demographic groups that Donald Trump was reliant on and continues to be reliant on if they want victories in the future, are now turning on him in record fashion. It took 7 months for the data points to suggest that the numbers that we saw in 2024 might go back to what they were in 2020. And while it's by no means a solid and locked-in set of circumstances, we are much closer to that reality than Republicans replicating that of the 2024 election. And while there's a lot of time between now and the midterms for things to change, what we're seeing at the end of the day right now is that Latino voters souring on Trump is no accident. They are upset with the current day and age of this administration, as are many voters across this nation. And they will likely vote accordingly, even if they might have voted different in the 2024 presidential election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.